What's up, guys? I'm Nobody Special, and Jerome Powell, Uncle J. Powell, has finally given his much anticipated speech following the meeting at Jackson Hole. I have not seen it yet. It's come and gone. I'm going to do my reaction to it right now, so this is me watching it for the first time. So I apologize in advance if I suddenly hurl tomatoes or excrement or who knows what at the computer screen because I heard something I didn't like. You'll pardon my reaction. That being said, let's go to the videotape. We are going to shrink me. And there's Uncle J. Pow. And here we go.
Thank you, Esther, and good morning. 17 months have passed since the U.S. economy faced the full force of the COVID-19 pandemic. This shock led to an immediate and unprecedented decline, as large parts of the economy were shuttered to contain the spread of the disease.
And what a fantastic job they did containing the spread of the disease.
Recovery has been a difficult one, and a good place to begin is by thanking those on the front line fighting the pandemic. The essential workers who kept the economy going, those who have cared for others in need, and those in medical research, business, and government who came together to discover, produce, and widely distribute effective vaccines in record time. We should also keep in our thoughts those who have lost their lives from COVID, as well as their loved ones. Strong policy support has fueled a vigorous but uneven recovery, one that is, in many respects, historically anomalous. In a reversal of typical patterns in a downturn, aggregate personal income rose rather than fell, and households massively shifted their spending from services to manufactured goods.
Funny how that happens when you dump trillions of dollars from the sky and give it to everybody. Weird, right? When you create trillions of dollars out of thin air and pass it out, all of a sudden people have more dollars. What a remarkable data point you've discovered, Jerome. Is he taking credit for this? I don't know what he's saying here, Captain Obvious, but okay.
Booming demand for goods and the strength and speed of the reopening have led to shortages and bottlenecks, leaving the COVID-constrained supply side unable to keep up. The result has been elevated inflation in durable goods, a sector that has experienced an annual inflation rate well below zero over the past quarter century. Labor market conditions are improving but turbulent, and the pandemic continues to threaten not only health and life, but also economic activity. Many other advanced economies are experiencing similarly unusual conditions. In my comments today, I will focus on the Fed's efforts to promote our maximum employment and price stability goals amid this upheaval, and suggest how lessons from history and a careful focus on incoming data and the evolving risks offer useful guidance for today's unique monetary policy challenges. The pandemic recession, the briefest yet deepest on record, displaced roughly 30 million workers in the space of 2 months. The decline in output in the second quarter of 2020 was twice the full decline during the Great Recession. But the pace of the recovery has exceeded expectations, with output surpassing its previous peak after only 4 quarters, less than half the time required following the Great Recession.
Again, is he taking credit for this? I'm not sure what he's doing here. Yeah, the recession was short because you dumped $1 trillion a day, it seemed, from the sky. Of course, it was a short recession because you committed the ultimate historical screw up of printing money to solve your economic problems, and history has shown what the consequences of that are, and we're now living through them. So now that we're living through them, I don't get why you're sitting here patting yourself on the back for a short recession when the mayhem that's on the horizon is the direct result of that. So I don't really agree with that. And the other thing, and I saw some comments by Bullard today, also from the Federal Reserve, talking about economic growth and GDP growth? Well, when you have high inflation and you measure your economic output by the dollar value of all goods and services produced, well, inflation looks like economic growth when you measure it that way. When there's not really any more goods and services being produced, there's actually fewer goods and services being produced, but the dollar value of them has gone up. That's not economic growth. That's the death of your currency. So be careful before you pat yourself on the back here.
As is typically the case, the recovery in employment has lagged that in output. Nonetheless, employment gains have also come faster than expected. The economic downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on lower wage workers in the service sector and on African Americans and Hispanics.
It's funny you should mention that, Jerome, because the people who are most impacted by your inflation are those same groups, lower incomes and minorities. The people who are most hurt by the cost of everything going up are those people that you're virtue signaling right now to pretend to show empathy or sympathy with. You're making their lives more difficult through inflation.
The unevenness of the recovery can further be seen through the lens of the sectoral shift of spending into goods, particularly durable goods such as appliances, furniture, and cars, and away from services, particularly in-person services in areas such as travel and leisure. As the pandemic struck, restaurant meals fell 45%, air travel 95%, and dentist visits 65%. Even today, with overall GDP and consumption spending more than fully recovered, services...
Did anybody else find it a little weird that he mentions restaurants, hotels, and then dentists? That seemed a little weird. Like, you know, one of these things is not like the other. Restaurants, hotels, and dentists. Anyway, long-term health implications of an entire country of people not going to the dentist for a year, probably pretty expensive, especially in a country that is widely moving towards socialized medicine. But I digress.
Spending remains about 7% below trend. Total employment is now 6 million below its February 2020 level, and 5 million of that shortfall is in the still depressed service sector. In contrast, spending on durable goods has boomed since the start of the recovery and is now running about 20% above the pre-pandemic level. With demand outstripping pandemic-afflicted supply, rising durables prices are a principal factor lifting inflation well above our 2% objective. Given the ongoing upheaval in the economy, some strains and surprises are inevitable. The job of monetary policy is to promote maximum employment and price stability as the economy works through this challenging period. I'll turn now to a discussion of progress toward those goals. The outlook for the labor market has brightened considerably in recent months. After faltering last winter, job gains have risen steadily over the course of this year and now average 832,000 over the past 3 months, of which almost 800,000 have been in services. The pace of total hiring is faster than at any time in the recorded data before the pandemic. The levels of job openings and quits are at record highs, and employers report.
That last point he just made is important. The rate of job openings and quits are at record highs. The Great Resignation, they're calling it. More people are quitting their jobs right now than ever before. Now, there's a lot of reasons being cited for that. People learn things about themselves spending a year working from home. Now their priorities and what a good job looks like have changed. But inflation is also a factor in that, right? Especially like we're having a hard time getting people to come back into services and low-wage jobs. Well, you think when the price of childcare has gone up by 10, 15%, guess what? It's no longer worth it for that person to go back to work because they save more money staying home and taking care of the kids than they do going to work and paying for childcare. So, you're going to see this recurring chicken or the egg theme throughout this speech, where he's saying we expect some of these effects, some of these things like the shortage of labor or, the shortages of chips are the result of, are affecting inflation in a temporary way. Well, personally, I think we have the labor shortage and we have the material shortages because of the inflation, not the other way around. I don't think we have the inflation because of the shortage. It's a chicken or the egg scenario, and I think Powell knows this. He's not a dummy. He knows this. He's just towing the party line here.
Report that they cannot fill jobs fast enough to meet returning demand. These favorable conditions for job seekers should help the economy cover the considerable remaining ground to reach maximum employment. The unemployment rate has declined to 5.4%, a post-pandemic low, but is still much too high, and the reported rate understates the amount of labor market slack. Long-term unemployment remains elevated, and the recovery in labor force participation has lagged well behind the rest of the labor market, as it has in past recoveries. With vaccinations rising, schools reopening, and enhanced unemployment benefits ending, some factors that may be holding back job seekers are likely fading. While the Delta variant presents a near-term risk, the prospects are good for continued progress toward maximum employment.
He better hope so, okay? What he's saying is because the expanded unemployment benefits are going away soon, we think this massive shortage of labor in the economy is going to go away. He better hope that happens, because I think a lot of business owners are holding off on wage increases right now because they're hoping when the unemployment benefits go away that people come back to work that they need. If they don't, then those business owners are going to be forced to raise wages. They'll just have to. And when you're forced to raise wages without any corresponding growth in productivity, then you have to raise the price of your finished product or service, which leads to more inflation. So he better hope he's right about these unemployment benefits expiring, forcing people to go back to work. I'm not sure that's really the case. If people don't come back to work when these benefits expire, then the wage pressures are going to drive inflation higher.
The rapid reopening of the economy has brought a sharp run-up in inflation.
You think?
Over the 12 months through July, measures of headline and core PCE inflation have run at 4.2% and 3.6% respectively, well above our 2% longer-run objective. Businesses and consumers widely report upward pressure on prices and wages. Inflation at these levels is, of course, a cause for concern. But that concern is tempered by a number of factors that suggest that these elevated readings are likely to prove temporary. This assessment is a critical and ongoing one, and we are carefully monitoring incoming data. The dynamics of inflation are complex, and we assess the inflation outlook from a number of different perspectives, as I will now discuss. The spike in inflation is so far largely the product of a relatively narrow group of goods and services that have been directly affected by the pandemic and the reopening of the economy.
Here's his chicken or the egg argument.
Durable goods alone contributed about 1% to the latest 12-month measures of headline and core inflation. Energy prices, which rebounded with the strong recovery, added another 0.8% to headline inflation. And from long experience, we expect the inflation effects of these increases to be transitory.
There it is. Transitory.
In addition, some prices, for example, for hotel rooms and airplane tickets, declined sharply during the recession and have now moved back up close to pre-pandemic levels. The 12-month window we use in computing inflation now captures the rebound in prices, but not the initial decline, temporarily elevating reported inflation. These effects, which are adding a few tenths to measured inflation, should wash out over time.
Better hope so.
We consult a range of measures meant to capture whether price increases for particular items are spilling over into broad-based inflation. These include trimmed mean measures and measures excluding durables and computed from just before the pandemic.
This is fancy Fed talk for we adjust the numbers to say what we want them to say.
These measures generally show inflation at or close to our 2% longer run objective. We would be concerned at signs that inflationary pressures were spreading more broadly through the economy. We are also directly monitoring the prices of particular goods and services most affected by the pandemic and the reopening, and are beginning to see a moderation in some cases as shortages ease. Used car prices, for example, appear to have stabilized. Indeed, some price indicators are beginning to fall. If that continues, as many analysts predict, then used car prices will soon be pulling measured inflation down, as they did for much of the past decade. This same dynamic of upward inflation pressure dissipating and in some cases reversing seems likely to play out in durables more generally.
If you've been following my channel, we have talked about this, about how used cars obviously can't sustain that ridiculous run-up in price that they had. But that is going to be more than offset by the rising rent. And I've done a couple of videos about how rents going up is eventually going to impact the inflation numbers, even their bogus owner's equivalent rent numbers. And we've got a whole year of rising inflation reads because of the rent going up that's ahead of us. And he's being a little disingenuous here when he's saying we expect that these car prices are going to go down, because used car prices, I think, is only like 7% of the input to the CPI read, whereas owner's equivalent rent is 24%. So this one data point that we're clinging to for dear life should hopefully lessen the effect on inflation, even though there's this monster over in the other corner on the horizon. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to pretend to be surprised when that hits.
Over the 25 years preceding the pandemic, durables prices actually declined, with inflation averaging negative 1.9% per year. As supply problems have begun to resolve, inflation in durable goods other than autos has now slowed and may be starting to fall. It seems unlikely that durables inflation will continue to contribute importantly over time to overall inflation.
Tell that to the crews of those ships that are lined up 30 deep outside of Los Angeles right now, waiting to unload their cargo of Chinese crap into our markets, and the 20 other ships that are steaming towards Los Angeles at the same time. Who is he kidding? All of this stimmy money is chasing goods, and that's what you're seeing here. That this big spike here in durable goods. This is Chinese crap being bought by Americans with stimulus money at record paces. This is inflation. And I don't think it's temporary. I really don't.
We will be looking for evidence that supports or undercuts that expectation. We also assess whether wage increases are consistent with our 2% inflation goal over time. Wage increases are essential to support a rising standard of living and are generally, of course, a welcome development. But if wage increases were to move materially and persistently above the levels of productivity gains and inflation, businesses would likely pass those increases on to customers, a process that could become the sort of wage price spiral seen at times in the past. Today, we see little evidence of wage increases that might threaten excessive inflation.
Okay, this is why I can't stand these academics. All right, what he's saying, we see little evidence of wage inflation above our inflation target or above our inflation read. So therefore, it's not a problem. And I guess he's right? If wages go up too fast and there's no increase in productivity, then that leads to higher prices, which drives inflation higher. However, the one big thing that he's leaving out here is when wages rise slower than inflation, that's people's lives getting more difficult. And that's what these muckety-mucks that never get out of the office, that never get away from their mahogany bookshelves behind them, don't understand, is that what they do makes life miserable for people. And if you think I'm kidding, go look at WTF happened in 1971 and look what has happened to the middle class in the United States. That is the direct result of inflation. It drives people into poverty. It takes people who were once middle class and it forces most of them down into poverty, and a few lucky ones manage to escape into the upper middle class. Man, that really, oh, I was waiting for some kind of comment like this. That one really grinds my gears. Inflation is not a good thing. All right, this 2% target inflation, we always want inflation. That's him saying we want life to be constantly more difficult for people than it was last year. We want to constantly make the American dream a little bit less attainable for the average working person. That's what I can't stand about this theory. And that, all right, I'm getting too heated now. Let's carry on, shall we?
Broad-based measures of wages that adjust for compositional changes in the labor force, such as the Employment Cost Index and the Atlanta Wage Growth Tracker, show wages moving up at a pace that appears consistent with our longer-term inflation objective. We will continue to monitor this carefully.
You do that, Jay.
Policymakers and analysts generally believe that as long as longer-term inflation expectations remain anchored, policy can and should look through temporary swings in inflation. Our monetary policy framework emphasizes that anchoring longer-term expectations at 2% is important for both maximum employment and price stability.
So here he is moving the goalpost. All right, if you remember, he started the year saying inflation is below our 2% goal, and then he moved on to say we're going to let inflation run a little hot, and now inflation is running pretty hot, right? We've got some of the highest reads in 30 years. Now he's saying it's okay because our long-term expectations are anchored at around 2%. See, that's him saying, I don't really know what's going on. I'm totally failing in my mandate of price stability, but that's okay because, hey, when you average everything out, eventually things will return to normal. All right, this is Powell moving the goalpost. This is not ownership. This is not, hey, we got this one wrong. No, this is him just changing the definition of what success looks like.
We carefully monitor a wide range of indicators of longer-term inflation expectations. These measures today are at levels broadly consistent with our 2% objective. Because measures of inflation expectations are individually noisy, we also focus on common patterns across the measures.
Itself.
One approach to summarizing these patterns is the board staff's Index of Common Inflation Expectations, which combines information from a broad range of survey and market-based measures. This index captures a general move down in expectations starting around 2014, a time when inflation was running persistently below 2%. More recently, the index shows a welcome reversal of that decline and is now at levels more consistent with our 2% objective. Longer-term inflation expectations have moved much less than actual inflation or near-term expectations, suggesting that households, businesses, and market participants also believe that current high inflation readings are likely to prove transitory.
There it is. Drink. Transitory. Okay, what he just said was important. What he's saying is inflation expectations remain much lower than inflation. What he's saying is, thank God most people believe this bull that I come on TV and say month after month, and they don't believe that their money is becoming worthless, because that is the one missing ingredient that we don't have right now to von Mises crack up boom, which if you don't know what von Mises crack up boom is, go read it. It is a frightening story about what Ludwig von Mises, the father of Austrian economics, observed in Austria and Germany in the 1920s. Because what we have right now is your basic mechanical inflation, your scientific inflation of more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, and thus prices are rising. When you get the crack up boom, that's when you get hyperinflation. You see, that's when people start to believe that inflation is going to get worse, and thus start adjusting their behavior and increasing their spending to hurry up and quick trade in your dollars for anything you can sell tomorrow at a higher price. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that sends prices rocketing upward. All right, that's von Mises crack up boom. That is the stampede for the exits as people rush to get out of dollars in exchange for anything. All right, and so for him saying inflation expectations remain lower than actual inflation, that's Jerome Powell saying, "Whew, thank God people believe this BS that I spout on TV day in and day out about transitory, because if they didn't, inflation would be so much worse."
And that in any case, the Fed will keep inflation close to our 2% objective over time. Finally, it is worth noting that since the 1990s, inflation in many advanced economies has run somewhat below 2%, even in good times. The pattern of low inflation likely reflects sustained disinflationary forces, including technology, globalization, and perhaps demographic factors, as well as a stronger and more successful commitment by central banks to maintain price stability.
I don't
In the
believe
United
this data.
States, unemployment
I just
ran
have to
below
say it.
4% for about 2 years before the pandemic, while inflation ran at or below 2%. Wages did move up across the income spectrum, a welcome development, but not by enough to lift price inflation consistently to 2%. While the underlying global disinflationary factors are likely to evolve over time, there is little reason to think that they have suddenly reversed or abated. It seems more likely that they will continue to weigh on inflation as the pandemic passes into history. We will continue to monitor incoming inflation data against each of these assessments. To sum up, the baseline outlook is for continued progress toward maximum employment, with inflation returning to levels consistent with our goal of inflation averaging 2% over time.
Averaging 2%.
Let me now turn to how the baseline outlook and the associated risks and uncertainties figure in our monetary policy making. The period from 1950 through the early 1980s provides two important lessons for managing the risks and uncertainties we face today. The early days of stabilization policy in the 1950s taught monetary policymakers not to attempt to offset what are likely to be temporary fluctuations in inflation. Indeed, responding may do more harm than good, particularly in an era where policy rates are much closer to the effective lower bound even in good times. The main influence of monetary policy on inflation can come after a lag of a year or more. If a central bank tightens policy in response,
He's talking about the periods of the 1950s through the 80s, right? Which that's a curious data set because from the 1950s to early 1970s, we were on the gold standard. And then we went off the gold standard in 71. So I guess what he's saying is the relative inaction of the Federal Reserve in the 50s, 60s, or the 50s and the 60s was a good thing. I would agree with that. But you also have to factor in that the dollar was pegged to gold back then. So, of course, your currency was more stable. I mean, I don't understand this comparison he's making now. Is he comparing the lunacy of monetary policy today to the price stability of the 1950s and 60s? Who is he kidding? I mean, who is he kidding right now? I mean, I guess he's thinking, luckily, most people alive today weren't alive during that period and won't know what complete and utter nonsense I'm spouting right now. Anyway.
response to factors that turn out to be temporary, the main policy effects are likely to arrive after the need has passed. The ill-timed policy move unnecessarily slows hiring and other economic activity and pushes inflation lower than desired. Today, with substantial slack remaining in the labor market and the pandemic continuing, such a mistake could be particularly harmful.
It seems like he's making a case for inaction right now, and I have to take issue with that because, Jay Powell, the time to taper was a long time ago. Okay? This inflation genie is out of the bottle, and he's only just beginning to wreak havoc with the global economy. And you're sitting here saying now we don't want to move too soon. You never should have started printing to begin with, okay? You didn't have to lower interest rates back in January or December of 2018 or January of 2019. You could have taken the recession that was long overdue back then. But you chose to lower rates. You chose to be dovish to inflate the asset bubble. You could have let the spike in interest rates happen in September of 2019 during the repo crisis or repo madness. You could have let the recession that was long overdue happen then, but you chose to take dovish action, further inflating the asset bubble. And then the pandemic hit, and you took your previous bad decisions and you doubled down and made the mother of all bad decisions, and you dumped trillions into the economy. And now you're sitting here telling us that you don't want to act too hastily and cause problems. Where was this mentality 2-3 years ago? My God.
We know that extended periods of unemployment can mean lasting harm to workers and to the productive capacity of the economy. History also teaches, however, that central banks cannot take for granted that inflation due to transitory factors will fade.
There it is. Drink. Transitory.
The 1970s saw two periods in which there were large increases in energy and food prices, raising headline inflation for a time. But when the direct effects on headline inflation eased, core inflation continued to run persistently higher than before. One likely contributing factor was that the public had come to generally expect higher inflation. One reason why we now monitor inflation expectations so carefully. Central banks have always faced the problem of distinguishing transitory inflation spikes from more troublesome developments. And it is sometimes difficult to do so with confidence in real time. At such times, there is no substitute for a careful focus on incoming data and evolving risks. If sustained higher inflation were to become a serious concern, the FOMC would certainly respond and use our tools to assure that inflation runs at levels that are consistent with our goal. Incoming data should provide more evidence that some of the supply-demand imbalances are improving, and more evidence of a continued moderation in inflation, particularly in goods and service prices that have been most affected by the pandemic.
What data is he looking at? I don't get what he's talking about here. That he expects moderation in these supply chain imbalances. Where is the supply chain moderating? I see the cost of shipping containers going up. I see lead times going up. I see more and more price hikes. I see more and more shortages. What is he talking about? What data is he looking at? Jay, get out of your office. Do your own shopping for a change. My God.
We also expect to see continued strong job creation, and we'll be learning more about the Delta variant's effects. For now, I believe that policy is well positioned. As always, we are prepared to adjust policy as appropriate to achieve our goals. That brings me to a concluding word on the path ahead for monetary policy. The committee remains steadfast in our oft-expressed commitment to support the economy for as long as is needed to achieve a full recovery. The changes we made last year to our monetary policy framework are well suited to address today's challenges. We have said that we would continue our asset purchases at the current pace until we see substantial further progress toward our maximum employment and price stability goals, measured since last December when we first articulated this guidance. My view is that the substantial further progress test has been met for inflation. There has also been clear progress toward maximum employment. At the FOMC's recent July meeting, I was of the view, as were most participants, that if the economy evolved broadly as anticipated, it could be appropriate to start reducing the pace of asset purchases this year. The intervening month has brought more progress in the form of a strong employment report for July, but also the further spread of the Delta variant. We will be carefully assessing incoming data and the evolving risks. Even after our asset purchases end, our elevated holdings of longer.
So what did he just say there? So he said we're closer to our decision to taper than we were a month ago. All right, that's at least what I took away from that. He said, we're thinking about, and I guess now he's saying we're thinking harder about thinking about. And then he threw in there, but that Delta variant is out there, so he left himself an out. Which, let's face it, folks, it's going to get cold soon. We've got the fall coming up, right? The windows are going to close and people are going to spend more time indoors, and this is a respiratory pathogen. Cases are going to rise in the coming months. Right? I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist or whatever, or a virologist. But when it gets cold, people get sick. Gross oversimplification. So I mean, he just said we're closer now to tapering this year, but the Delta variant. So I don't know how to interpret that. That is the most carefully worded non-answer. I'm going to take that as very, very mildly hawkish. But the fact that he said the end of the year and he left himself an out tells me the taper is not happening in September. Or at least it's not happening in August, maybe September. So maybe they announce something in September. I don't know. There was nothing earth-shattering there. Let's put it that way.
Longer-term securities will continue to support accommodative financial conditions. The timing and pace of the coming reduction in asset purchases will not be intended to carry a direct signal regarding the timing of interest rate liftoff, for which we have articulated a different and substantially more stringent test. We have said that we will continue to hold the target range for the federal funds rate at its current level until the economy reaches conditions consistent with maximum employment and inflation has reached 2% and is on track to moderately exceed 2% for some time. We have much ground to cover to reach maximum employment, and time will tell whether we have reached 2% inflation on a sustainable basis.
I think time will tell that we would be praying for inflation at just 2% on a sustainable basis. That's just me. So what he's saying right now is we're a little closer to a taper, but don't worry, rate hikes are still a long way off. No news on rate hikes. That's, again, not earth-shattering news. I think that's what the market was expecting.
Challenging times for the public we serve, as the pandemic and its unprecedented toll on health and economic activity linger. But I will end on a positive note.
Good.
Before the pandemic, we all saw the extraordinary benefits that a strong labor market can deliver to our society. Despite today's challenges, the economy is on a path to just such a labor market, with high levels of employment and participation, broadly shared wage gains, and inflation running close to our price stability goal. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me just say how bunk I think that last statement was. All right. He just said that our labor market is strong. Our labor market is so out of whack right now. I mean, we have job openings that can't be filled. We have millions of job openings in this country, and yet there are millions of people out of work that somehow these two are not coming together. That is not a strong labor market. That is a broken labor market. You have excess in one area, you have shortage in the other, and there is no way to rectify the two, at least not right now. And my personal opinion is the reason why that gap is because of the inflation, because there's no reason to go back to work for a job that pays $14 an hour or $15 an hour right now if it means you have to pay somebody $2,000 a month to take care of your kids. That is driving low workforce participation. And he even said that labor force participation remains strong. What data is he looking at? Labor force participation has gone way, way down since the pandemic hit. And, prior to the pandemic, that was on the up and up. That was workforce participation was increasing every month. So, again, what data is Powell looking at? I don't know. And I'm just going to leave you with this. A lot of the things that Powell is citing as excuses for why the inflation is happening right now, in my opinion, are not the reasons why inflation is happening. They are the result of the inflation that Powell's money printing has caused. I think that is leading to the imbalances in the job market, and that's leading to the shortages in durable goods and the congestion at the ports and the mayhem we're going to see in the Christmas shopping season this year. So, anyways, guys, thank you for putting up with my shouting at the screen. I know I got a little heated there at a couple of points. I apologize for that. I want to thank you guys for your time and for watching this video. Please remember, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell. It would really help me out. I would be forever in your debt. In the meantime, live small, dream big.